This episode of Truth Table is brought to you by our NAACP Image Award nominated book, Truth Table: Black Women's Musings on Life, Love, and Liberation. Get it where all books are sold.
Sisters, how y'all feel? Brothers, y'all all right? If this is your first time at Truth Table, welcome to the table. And if you've been sitting at the table with us all these years, we are so grateful that you have been listening to us through these years, and we are inviting you to partner with us and support our work at patreon.com/truthstable. Now pull up a chair and have a seat at the table with us.
So, just a couple of thoughts this morning. The first one is, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I tend to be a person that people think they know, but I'm like, no, y'all don't really know me. I've got some quirks to me, and that's one of the things that I like the most about myself. I like my quirkiness. And one of those quirks you will find if you spend some time in my home, because if you walk through our home and there happen to be a couple TVs placed, you're going to see some different programming that's on. There's going to be a posse in the house that are very serious about murder mysteries. I'm not going to tell you anybody's name, but I'm just going to let you know if you walk through the house, you might catch Columbo. You might catch, a Hercule Poirot, Murder, She Wrote, Agatha Christie, okay? It's going down. There's another crew in the house, and I'm going to leave them nameless, that if you walk by what they're watching, it's probably got the word star in it. Star Wars, Star Trek, Guardians of the Galaxy, anything Marvel, cartoons, comic books, TV shows, movies, you name it. We have spent much money on that franchise. And here's the thing, I personally love both of those genres. I do, I'm down with it. I'm down with the mysteries. I'm down with the Marvel. You will find me amongst the people. I do not turn up my nose at it, but there is one thing that I believe in my home I stand alone in loyalty to, and those are the rom-coms. Thank you. I see that I'm not alone, and I appreciate that there is a place for us. There is grace for us this morning. Those who love the rom-com. By the way, rom-com, for those who do not know, those are the romance comedies. See, those who know, they know. Romance comedies. And that is my genre. Me and my fellow siblings who are amongst us this morning, we are single-handedly keeping Hallmark and Christmas movies in business. And we're okay with that. We're okay. And I know that some of you right now might be thinking that that genre is downright unserious, that you think it's cheesy, that maybe you have been on the side of mockery and you have mocked those who love this genre. But I want to let you know that we don't care. We don't care. We don't care if you don't like our genre, because we like it all by ourselves with our comfy socks and our bag of popcorn. And I even propose to you this morning that there is a philosophical reason, at least for me, why I love rom-coms. I propose to you this morning that this world that we live in is topsy-turvy and crazy. It's downright unpredictable. And I know it might ruin it for some of you that when you watch a movie, you know exactly what's going to happen. But I'm okay with that. Because I like some things in my life to know exactly how it's going to turn out. I like that I know in the first 5 minutes of the movie how the last 5 minutes of that movie is going to go. I know that that couple who seems to be missing each other, or maybe they're angry with each other, or they're from two opposing families, or one of them wears glasses and they haven't removed the glasses, and behold, the beauty of their face that's underneath those glasses. Glasses are very powerful in movies, y'all. I know y'all think that's cheesy, but I know that in the last 5 minutes, they are going to be confessing their undying love for each other. And in between that time, there's going to be mishaps and mayhem and confusion and missed opportunities. Someone's going to get on the subway too fast and someone's going to miss it. I know how it works. I've written the script. But I still value knowing those last 5 minutes. And as the credits roll and the music plays, I am left with the impression, you are left with the impression, and we don't really want to know anymore, that they lived happily ever after. Our times are filled with swift transition, confusion, shocking losses, bad news that knock us off of our feet. Our money gets strange, and quite frankly, people get stranger. Those who once said they would always be there are not, and those who we imagine always being there are often gone way too soon. So don't blame me for liking some predictable things in the midst of this highly unpredictable world. Our text this morning from the book of Ruth finds us on this Mother's Day, we find ourselves among a group of grieving widows who I imagine are absolutely tired, exhausted by the unpredictability of life. And when I think about Ruth and Orpah and Naomi, I think about what it means to be in a society where the men are systematically and systemically and historically snatched away, whether that's through war, disease, or oppression. And these women are left to make do, and they're judged for how they do it. Does this sound familiar? The book of Ruth is no rom-com, and y'all know how much I like them. Ruth is no rom-com any more than the book of Esther. Neither is about 7 steps to finding your Boaz or your King Xerxes. And by the way, you don't want a King Xerxes. You don't. You do not want a King Xerxes. The church, in segments of it, has a long history of turning these books named after women into telenovelas, into soap operas, into romance books. And while they do highlight God's faithfulness through a union, these books are about God's mighty hand at work through ordinary women, showing his powerful love and bringing his purposes to pass. That is the greater story. Man's chief aim, humanity's chief aim. Our highest end is to glorify God and to fully enjoy him forever. So this is a book that reminds us that through dangers, toils, and snares, and trials, and tribulations, that nothing, and I mean nothing, can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. That is the glorious last 5 minutes of our movie. Triumph, victory, restoration, dignity will live on eternally, happily ever after. Even though, for some of us, those first 5 minutes feel tragic with a capital T. In the early pages of the book of Ruth, we find a woman, and dare I say a church woman, named Naomi, whose circumstances in her home and in her world have left her downright weary and bitter. Now, if I had some honest people amongst me today, you might be able to testify that you know the feeling of bitterness as well. As Pastor Micah reminded us previously, Naomi had followed her husband, accompanied by their sons from Bethlehem to Moab, from the Holy Land to Sin City. The Holy Land did not feel to them at the time like a land of abundance or promise, so they moved their people to a place they thought would be better. Yet at some point, Elimelech dies. That's Naomi's husband. And her sons, Mahlon and Chilion, marry women who were there from Moab, Orpah and Ruth. And they had 10 years together, and then her sons also died. Would you pause with me as Julie allowed us to do so beautifully through her prayer? Would you pause and feel that moment? Don't let it pass you by. When those moments that happen to you in life, you ought to pause and feel them too. Have you ever been deeply, deeply disappointed? You took the steps, you did the things you thought you were supposed to do, you made the best out of what you had, and yet it just did not work out. That disappointment cuts you to the core. You feel it dare I say, even in your body. Experiencing disappointment hurts us both mentally and physically. One research article reminds us that pain doesn't lessen as it happens over and over again. In other words, we don't get used to disappointment. We don't get conditioned from it. We may find ourselves feeling tired and heavy and burdened, and others may find themselves numb as if the world is speeding by them. And why does this happen? Why does it hurt so much, disappointment? Well, when we feel physical pain, our body almost instantaneously sends endorphins. I know if you stumped your big toe, or maybe the pinky toe before. The brain immediately reacts to that. But the brain does not immediately react to grief, to sorrow, to disappointment. Endorphins are not suddenly released when we get that tragic phone call. So, we're left to figure it out physiologically. And this is why, for some of us, it takes those symptoms of depression and deep disappointment to express itself in our bodies before we take a moment to give ourselves the grace that we need. So we actually have less reserves to deal with our emotional pain than our physical pain. So we should take our emotional pain very seriously. And often we don't address it until our body feels it. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me is a lie. That adage is limited because words and circumstances and disappointments absolutely hurt us. And the words that we say to others absolutely can hurt them. So your feelings do matter this morning. Can you consider Naomi again for a moment, what it means to leave home for a better life in a better land, or so you thought, only to be met with overwhelming loss and grief with limited reserves to address this deep, deep, staggering sorrow. The disappointment is incalculable. And in this next verse, Mother Naomi has gotten word that there is something better back at home in Bethlehem. Basic provisions. A harvest is coming. So she initially starts her travel back, as we've heard before, with her daughters-in-law, these two young widows, and they make their way to travel back to her home. And she begins to make the case, every case she can possibly make, to convince them to not come with her. She reminds them of all her impossibilities and none of God's possibilities. Verse 11, but Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons? Who could become your husbands? In other words, what do I have for you? I've got nothing left to offer." Verse 12, return home, my daughters. I am too old, again, making the case, to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, she's laying up all the math. Would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you. In other words, my sorrow might be contagious. You might want to get away from me because the Lord's hand has turned against me. If Naomi tells the story, and by the way, she is telling the story right now in the text, she's got nothing but ashes. She's got nothing left but memories of the good old days and cannot even imagine that they would ever become something different. She has placed God's love on trial, which is what you and I are tempted to do when injustice and death and hardship and inescapable suffering come our way. We say things, sometimes out loud, but certainly in our hearts, like, God, have you turned against me? Do you feel the sorrow now? Do you know this type of sorrow for yourself? This type of disappointment? So what I would encourage us this morning to be slow to judge ourselves, but also be slow to judge Naomi. Because unless you know what it's like to get that dreaded phone call, unless you know what it's like for your son not to come home, unless you know what it's like to leave babies at the hospital, unless you've gotten the call to identify a loved one, don't you judge her bitterness. I have reason to believe this morning, and I'm even reminded by Julie's beautiful prayer, that Jesus would have empathy for Naomi and for all of the Naomis that are in the house this morning. Jesus has empathy for you. Jesus knew what it was like to barely be able to lift his head. He knew what it's like to have blood streaming down into his eyes, to see his mother standing there as his body quivers closer and closer to death. Jesus knows the pain of saying goodbye very, very soon, and knows that his mother will need someone to help lift her and carry her through. Even if his mother understands the magnitude and the necessity and the calling of his death. So I want to preach to you this morning from the theme of the difference maker. The difference maker, or rather, what God can still do, even with your bitter heart. In verse 14, we find ourselves, and you might want to join in with these three widows. It says, at this, they wept aloud again. Orpah heard Naomi's last words to her, a reminder that there will be no more sons or a shot at a family, no more provisions coming from Naomi. And the text says, then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung to her. There is grace for the confused this morning. There is grace for the grieving this morning. There is grace for the bitter, even the ones that are bitter but pretending that they're not bitter. There is grace for those this morning. And God will get even an effective witness out of you. This grace does not require that we lie about the conditions of our world or our lives. God does give us beauty for ashes and does not ask us to lie about our present circumstances in order to receive it. Ashes are ashes. Death is death. Sorrow is sorrow. Sometimes the only thing that it seems as well in our lives as Christians is our soul. The prophet cries out, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help? And you will not listen, or cry to you violence, and you will not save. The law becomes slack, and justice never prevails. The wicked surround the righteous, therefore judgment comes forth perverted." Habakkuk, maybe you want to cry out with that prophet this morning. He cried this prayer just as the saints in Gaza and the Ukraine and Sudan cried now. And they cry not because they don't have faith. They cry because they do have faith. Faith in a God who rescues and redeems, even from the most grievous circumstances. Small children who are left alone, small infants who are left alone to tend to themselves, stop crying after a while. They no longer believe someone is coming to them. But the baby that cries, even the one that makes you tired, is a baby that knows that if I keep on crying, someone is coming to rescue me. Oh, child of God, when you cry out, it is an act of faith. God, the Redeemer, is coming for you. So let us keep crying out. Let us keep crying out, for it is our best act of faith for a God who will bottle every tear. And now we find Naomi, whose name means pleasant. Isn't that ironic? Rejecting that name, a name that seems to mock her at this point in her life. Her world has been turned upside down. And she's given herself a new name at the end of chapter 1. She's given herself the name Mara, bitter. Her soul is still anchored in the one who can turn our mourning into joy. So although she has a new name, she does not have a new God. So it's not a cliche. It's not just some church phrase throw away. It is the word of the living God that weeping may endure for a night, but joy will come in the morning. So you can change your name for a season. But know that God has a name for you that is eternal. And while it does matter what you call yourself, it matters most what God calls you and that God has called you. So what strikes me first in this passage is not that Naomi is distraught and grieved, because I do believe we have some empathetic hearts this morning. We get why she's distraught and grieved. I am distraught and grieved for her. Her reasons are clear. But my question, what puzzles me about this text, this is the question that causes me to scratch my head. The question is, why does Orpah leave, and why does Ruth stay? That's the question. That's the question. Why does Orpah go, and why does Ruth stay? And so this brings us to our first point this morning. God is the difference maker. Do you hear me this morning? That God is the difference maker. What's the difference between Orpah and Ruth? God is the difference maker. Naomi gives Orpah and Ruth every reason why they should not stick with her. Every reason why they should turn back. Every reason why they should go to their mother's house, into their mother's gods, to pagan gods to worship. And I must tell you that there are times that the church in America gives people every reason why it should do that as well. Don't you know, if you look real close at Naomi, she represents the people of God and the promises of God, but a little jacked up. But that's about right on this side of glory. Yet frustrated and bitter, she still represents the people of God. Yet broken and confused, she still represents the promises of God. And even if she can't see it, Ruth can see it. She represents the Old Testament church. Naomi does. And the church today at times feels similar to this place, where there's great criticism and confusion. There's great suffering and scandal at times. There's great letdowns and frustrations. And Naomi is giving every reason to these two women, who are also widows, why they should go back to where they've come from. It's better out there, she says. It's better out there in the world. I'm just going to stick around because this is kind of what my people do. But I can see why you would leave. But Ruth knows better. She doesn't know better because Naomi is well enough to offer her wisdom at this point. Ruth knows better because she has gotten a glimpse of what Naomi represents, even if Naomi doesn't see it at the moment. Attached to Naomi are the promises of God, and so despite Naomi's rejection of her own name and her assumption that God has turned his back on her, Ruth sees more than any of them can see in the moment for themselves. Don't you know, there are people who are going to stick with the church no matter what. Not because they're in denial. I've seen the data. I've been in all kinds of places, y'all. But they're not giving up on the church because Jesus is not giving up on the church. And I'll never give up on the church as long as Christ doesn't give up on me. He is the head of the church. And I know church hurt, got long receipts, y'all. And I know church foolishness, got long receipts. Leaders and people from the pews to the pulpits hurt and hurting others. And yet, God has given a promise that Christ will return for a church without spot or wrinkle. And I know we seem real spotty and wrinkly right now. But Jesus will make it so. And as long as he keeps me and he keeps you and he keeps us, we will be kept. So what our honorable mother in the faith, Ruth, understands is that God's promises, The difference maker's promises are bigger than Naomi's hopelessness at the moment. God's promises are bigger than your hopelessness at the moment. God's promises are bigger than your confusion at the moment. God's promises are bigger than your disappointment. And it's true, and it's wrong, and it's unfair, and it hurts, and yet God's promises are still bigger. God is the difference maker. Ruth is a woman that, because of her Moabite identity, can be rejected by the very people whose God she's clinging to, because she can see their God more brilliantly than they can at times. Here she is, a woman that we talk about today, a Gentile woman, a woman considered a heathen. And we're reading the book of Ruth this morning. Why? Because God, the difference maker, will exalt your name. God, the difference maker, will make your place in history. And I know all you can see is suffering. I know all that you can see is that it's not working out. But yet hold on. The difference maker draws near. And God will use you, yes, even you, as a mouthpiece for his glory. God has a story that he's writing about you, a story that bitterness can't snuff out, a story that heartbreak cannot snuff out, a story that loss and grief and disappointment cannot snuff out. The difference maker makes all the difference. So cling koinonia to God. I propose, though, that Jesus answers this question way better than I can about why does Orpah go and why does Ruth stay? And this is why koinonia, if we're going to be any kind of church with an adjective or before koinonia, we need to be a praying church. A praying church. Because we're praying to ask God to do what only God can do, which is give us fertile soil. Hear the words of Jesus in Matthew 13. This is why I speak to them in parables, he says. Though seeing they do not see, spiritually speaking, though hearing they do not hear or understand, in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears. They have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their ears and see with their eyes and hear with their ears. Understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are you. Blessed are you, y'all. For your eyes, because they can see, your ears, they can hear. For truly I tell you that many prophets and righteous people long to see what you can see if you are a child of God in the house this morning, and to hear what you can hear. Verse 18, listen to what the parable of the sower means. You want to know why Orpah left and why Ruth stayed? Verse 19, when anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since there is no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. In other words, suffering shows what they are truly made of. Verse 22, the seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of life, and my God, this life has worries in it, and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil, say good soil, refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. Ruth has experienced good soil. Hear me. She has crazy, awful experiences, losses, and death. These circumstances are compounding, and yet she still got good soil. She's still got good roots. Your soil matters. And you might have 99 problems, child of God, but good soil ain't one of them. If you have God, you have good soil. So praise God for that. Praise God for that. That circumstances cannot snatch what God has sown in your life. So Ruth is not simply making a pledge to love her mother-in-law, but more deeply and truly, she's making a pledge to follow God, come what may, his will. Come what may, his will. So this morning, ask yourself, where do your affections lie? What would suffering reveal about you? Why would Ruth stay and Orpah go? But I guess the greater question is, what makes you stay? What makes you stay? And I pray this morning that my answer and your answer will be the difference maker, Jesus, and Jesus alone. So, Koinonia, let's trust in God's keeping power, amen? And so we've reached our second point, and they get faster. They do. Remember the first one. God is the difference maker. And here's the second. God's declaration is greater than Naomi's. God's declaration is greater than yours. You can change your name for a season, I get it. But know that God has a name written for you that lasts forever. And just like his mercy, that name will endure forever. Naomi and Ruth, they're not naive, they're not deluded. Their life is lifing. In chapter 1, it is hard. It is Job level hard. And we don't think about it that way. And I wonder why we don't think about it that way. Oh, but it's Job level hard. And people of God, we have to let people tell the truth on themselves. That if they're lonely and heartbroken, they get to say that. If they're strapped for cash and confused, they get to say that. If they're weak in their bodies, troubled in their minds, we get to tell the truth. And the reason why we can tell these small t truths is because the truest truth is the love of God. And the love of God can handle all of your small t truths, so you don't have to front or hide or make believe or imposter or act. The truest truth is the love of God. So we can be honest about the first 5 minutes of the story because we know the last 5 minutes. The truest truth is God's love. Their widow status is true. Their heartbreak is true. Their childless state is true. Naomi's grandchildless state is true. Their limitations placed by a sexist society, true. Oh, it's all true. Their dreams dashed, true. But God is not a man that he should lie, nor does he require that we lie. And we don't have to live in delusion. When pain is real, we get to say it. When loss is real, we get to say it. It's just that it's simply truer that the love of God is greater. So naming what is broken in our lives that longs for repair and healing is not a sin, but rather an act of faith as we cry out to the God who addresses it. It's folly to hide a wound. It is folly to hide a wound that needs to be healed. There is no hope of healing a wound that you hide. Sometimes we kid ourselves into thinking that we actually are doing a good job hiding our wounds. I mean, some of us are very good actors, but most of us aren't. So we might as well name what we're struggling with. We might as well say it out loud. Because telling the truth is restorative, even hard truths. And by the way, there is a negative side of this truth-telling, by the way, because there are some truth-tellers amongst us who can only tell bad truths. And that does give your brain a bit of a high. When you just go on a tangent, oh, you'll get a buzz, literally. You'll get a buzz from that. But may your truth that you tell also include your true testimony. May your truth also include some true testimonies about the mercy, the forgiveness, the restoration, and the healing of God. These lopsided Christian truth tellers who deny the glory of God when they have no testimony in their truth telling. Half-truths are whole lies. Tell the whole truth. So we must tell what is wrong. We must tell what is wrong, but never forget the one who is right. God's declaration is greater. God's declaration is greater. Greater than my declaration, greater than your declaration. God's declaration is greater than Naomi's. And finally, point 3. God's love for the generations produces a harvest. God's love is productive. It's efficacious. It brings forth life, renewal, and strength. So God's love will bring a harvest, but the question is, are the laborers here? That's a real question. Think about it, answer it in your heart. The harvest is here, but are the laborers here? So many in the church are leaving, and I'm not talking about Koinonia specifically, but the church in America. And so many more have never stepped foot in a church. We must offer Christ to every generation. And we cannot have a lopsided declaration. He is the solid rock on which we stand. And as we have learned from our spiritual mother, Ruth, her witness, we can't offer people husbands. We can't offer them guaranteed wealth or guaranteed healing, or that we won't ever disappoint them like their last church did. We can't make those promises. But what we can offer is the one whose love cannot even be separated by death itself. That not even death will stop the love of God. So Orpah went back home to her mother's house, to her pagan gods. Grief and doubt and heartbreak and lack and being pushed away by Naomi will tempt us to go back to which can bring us temporary satisfaction, momentary pleasure, simple familiarity. We're used to it. But it cannot bring new life. So Ruth stayed. Ruth stayed. Ruth clung to the God of Naomi. Not only did she have affections for Naomi, but moreover, her affections were resting in the God of her mother-in-law. So despite her mother-in-law's aches and groans, and despite her mother-in-law's command to go away, despite Naomi naming herself bitter and being bitter and acting bitter, Ruth is connected to the God of Naomi, even as Naomi wrestles with the providence of God. So we pray today for a generation that reminds us of our hope in Jesus. Ruth's generation is the younger generation in this story, reminding Naomi, the older generation, of who God is. So the first 5 minutes are indeed full of tragedy, but the last 5 minutes, y'all, we see a foreshadowing of glory upon glory upon glory. And this is no rom-com. I mean, it does end with Ruth and Boaz getting together. They are united in marriage. Spoiler alert. But rather, Ruth, the woman who clung to God, to the God of her bitter mother-in-law, finds herself now as a foremother of the Messiah at the end of this story. Now, that's an ending. That's right. Even bitterness, the bitterness of Naomi's heart, even the real pain of loss and despair, social instability, oppression and sexism and disconnection from her family of origin could not stop the plans of God for Ruth. It couldn't stop it for Naomi. It couldn't stop it for Boaz. And guess what? Can't stop it for you. The plans of God cannot be stopped for you. Ruth is clinging. And because she clings, eventually that gospel that comes through her as a foremother of the faith, that gospel comes and gets you. Don't you know you're in this story? You are in the book of Ruth. Ruth clings. Ruth clings. and her offspring, and that offspring, and that offspring bring forth our Messiah. Don't you know that you clinging is powerful? You can't see the future, but you don't know how many generations, how many people you are blessing by clinging. You don't know who is going to be restored, set free, made whole. You don't know by your simple act of clinging to the one who clings to you. So koinonia, when you have nothing left to do, you don't know where to turn, I encourage us this morning to cling to God. So we got to tell the generations behind us the truth that God does not delight in our sorrows or our grief. God sees our suffering, and we see it as well. Know that God works redemptively in it all. God will give us beauty for ashes. God will give us God's very self. And here's the thing, we don't have all the answers. And on this side of glory, we don't know why this man died in the book. We don't know why the sons died. We don't always get answers. What we get as the people of God is the presence and the promises of God until we see him face to face. That is what we get on this side of glory. And so I encourage you to cling to God, but I also encourage you to tell every generation about the one who's clinging to us. I encourage you to tell every generation, even to your bitter heart this morning, your weary heart this morning, Naomi's generation, Ruth's generation, I want you to tell them about a man, a God-man. A man who is the God of all generations. I want you to tell them about a God-man whose love and faithfulness is shown most mightily to those who weep and mourn. I want you to tell them about a God-man whose grace is sufficient. We must tell them about the difference maker, our God, who lived a perfect life, who died a death we should have died, but who rose again with all power in his hand, and not a power just for power's sake, but a power that is on the agenda of love and getting that love to every generation. The difference maker will make the difference. This is the one who we proclaim, even with grieving and bitter hearts. Thanks be to the God of Ruth, who is the difference maker. Amen. Amen.